Hello everyone, and welcome to my review of Dave the Diver. Okay, so Dave the Diver is a weird game. It's a game you've probably heard of already, or potentially even played, because this game has over 50,000 Steam reviews, which, if you're like me, is extremely surprising to hear. Where did this little weird game come from, and why is it so popular? And more importantly, is it even any good? Well, according to those Steam users, it is in fact very good, with an overwhelmingly positive 97% on Steam. So what's the deal with this game? Well, after putting in over 45 hours on my quest to 100% completion, I also think that the game is good. But it's also one that's very hard to explain or understand without playing it. That's because Dave the Diver is a surprisingly long, yet extremely polished, mixed genre game. Those two genres being roguelite and management. I've seen this specific combo in a few other games, namely Recettear and Moonlighter, if you're familiar with either of those. I played Recettear but didn't enjoy it and found it pretty unintuitive, and while I'm aware of Moonlighter, I never played it myself. So when Dave the Diver came along, I didn't even realize it was in the same genre as those two until I started to get into it. So that's the genre, but what's it like to play? Well, I describe it in two ways. Dave the Diver is a one more turn game, and also a minigame game. So let's break those down. First of all, I'd say that the core experience of playing Dave the Diver, irrespective of its mechanics, is a one more turn game. Think of Civilizations or Stardew Valley. All the systems in the game are driving to one goal for the player, getting them to never put the game down once they pick it up. Mobile games often use this insidiously in an attempt to monetize its behavior once you're hooked. But I'm happy to report that Dave the Diver is just a good old game. No microtransaction bullshit or monetization besides the upfront cost. This one more turn feeling is generated through all the systems being built around a day and night cycle with new events happening every loop. This means you start out in the morning to review your daily tasks before diving into the depths to complete quests and progress the story. Each day ends with setting up the restaurant at night before starting all over again. This is the framework that sets up the one more turn gameplay loop. That framework is filled in by frequent new mechanics, story, characters, progression systems, and just about everything else the game can think of. And honestly, it largely works. I had a hard time putting down the game, and I rarely got a feeling of exhaustion or grind. The risk of this gameplay loop is that if you lay on the novelty too quick, it can easily become overwhelming for the player. It can also create an experience that becomes extremely tedious to hop back in after every break. It's that sense of feeling lost or overwhelmed on what to do next. Fortunately, outside of the initial hours, I don't believe Dave the Diver falls into this trap too much, but I'll get more into that later. The other descriptor of Dave the Diver is that it's a minigame game. As you may have noticed from the title of this video, Dave the Diver is what happens if you take WarioWare and decide to contextualize all of the minigames with a story, game systems, and progression. I think we've already seen a great example of what this can look like through It Takes Two, the co-op minigame game by Hazelight Studios and its notorious CEO.
Fuck the Oscars, you know? Fuck the Oscars! Fuck you! I'll tell you!
So what does this look like for Dave the Diver? Well, it basically means that almost everything, from firing your harpoon gun to managing the restaurant itself, is a minigame. This also means that almost every larger system built on top of these are also minigames. Need to cook some food? Well, then it's Cooking Mama time, where you press the right QTEs to chop the food. Need to stealth into an enemy base? Time for a timing puzzle where you hide behind boxes. How about an anime dream sequence? Yep, that's a real thing in this game. Well, in that case, let's introduce a rhythm minigame and then never used again. The relevant part of all this is the sheer number of these different mechanics. If a game like Celeste is all about using a single set of mechanics to their absolute fullest, then Dave the Diver is the complete opposite. I wouldn't be surprised if there were over 100 unique minigame mechanics and systems, the vast majority of which are incredibly simple, taking only a few seconds to learn and perform. This is also how the game feeds into the one more turn addictive gameplay so well. Almost every day, they're introducing a new character, quest, or metagame progression system, almost all of which are tied into and supported by these minigames. The ones that aren't directly supported by minigames also tend to be extremely superficial. Collection goals, simple quests, daily tasks, etc. Well, this can work in games like It Takes Two, and while it does largely work in Dave the Diver, it isn't without its problems. As I mentioned earlier, the sheer number of mechanics and systems did at times feel overwhelming, as well as making the entire experience feel occasionally unsatisfying, as the transparency of ticking boxes off the checklist isn't very fulfilling. This is definitely something I experienced during my playthrough. In the initial 20 hours, I wasn't sold on the game due to these issues. I felt overwhelmed by how quickly they introduced new mechanics, all with new tutorials, and I found it hard to pick back up the game because of the lack of meaningful depth. Ironic, right? That said, the more I played the game, the more I started to enjoy it, because the farther I got, the less frequently new mechanics were introduced. You may also be surprised when you hear how long the game is. HowLongToBeat.com puts the average hours for the main story at 22.5, with the main story plus side content taking over 30 hours total. As I mentioned earlier, it took me 45 hours to 100%. I think this is worth highlighting because the game absolutely does not look like it would take that long to complete, but it really does. Some people might see cute pixel art aesthetic with a lighthearted tone and think it'd be more compact, or at least I did, but there's a lot of game here. This is not a game you can knock out in an afternoon or a weekend. That said, at only $20, it's a pretty good deal in terms of the quantity of content. Speaking of, let's get into the actual aspects of the game. I'm going to break down the next two sections into what I liked and what I didn't like. So first up, what I liked. The best part of the game is what is immediately obvious when looking at it. This game has beautiful pixel art, fantastic and memorable music, charming characters and cutscene animations, and a lovable, carefree tone filled with a great sense of humor. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you since it's easy to judge just by looking at it, but all I'll say is that this was more than enough for me to enjoy the game. The characters were entertaining and supported by energetic animation straight out of the Ace Attorney series. The depth of color and detail in the pixel art absolutely oozes from every frame. The humor genuinely made me laugh out loud. The game is packed with references from games like Pokemon and Half-Life, as well as anime, including a literal otaku obsessed with anime girls. Can relate. The restaurant portion of the game immediately brought to mind some of the best moments from Food Wars, with uptight judges being brought to tears of joy by the power of cooking alone. I also have to give a big shout out to the main UI being completely diegetic through the use of apps on a cell phone, even including a Temple Run and Tamagotchi app. So that's what I liked. Now for the downsides. The previous section was almost entirely about the visuals, tone, and aesthetic, meaning I didn't mention the gameplay at all. As you can guess, the gameplay fell a bit short for me. Not enough to ruin the experience, but enough to call it out as something that didn't resonate with me. As someone who cares about good gameplay more than visuals or story, it's pretty self-explanatory. I think it's important to note that this isn't a general criticism for this game design philosophy, because I really enjoyed It Takes Two, which had a similar design approach. To me, the key differences between these two experiences was the pacing. I found It Takes Two to be much more consistent at pacing out its content. That game is extremely intentional in contrasting things back to back, meaning if you finished a puzzle minigame, the next section would be more mechanically focused, possibly followed by a story moment afterwards. It's a careful balance of using each system or mechanic as a larger piece of the whole, and this is where I think Dave the Diver falters. The vast majority of the mechanics are introduced in the first half of the game, and in my experience, overwhelmingly so. This is why I enjoyed the later half of the game more, as it let the player rest and explore more on their own terms. Unfortunately, at that point the game was almost over, and I'd already experienced most of what it had to offer. I really think that if some of the metagame systems were tied more into the story missions or spread out evenly throughout the game, it'd feel less front-loaded. I also want to call out what I feel is an over-reliance on QuickTime events. Many of the minigames include QTEs, and personally, they're my least favorite form of minigame. They're extremely simple, and I think largely played out in gaming, especially button-mashing ones that honestly just hurt my old wrists. Weirdly enough, there's an option to auto-resolve that type of minigame, but frustratingly, it isn't as fast as doing it manually, meaning that I failed more often when using it and ended up just turning off the feature. Anyways, as I'm sure you can tell from these gripes, these are nitpicks rather than glaring issues with the game, meaning the overall experience was a positive one. If I had to score the game, I'd actually give it a solid 9 out of 10, which sounds really impressive. It kind of is, and I think the game has a dark horse shot of getting some Game of the Year nods at the Game Awards. But I also think it's important to contextualize that score. Even though it's hard for me to levy too many criticisms towards the game, it won't be making my top 5 Game of the Year list, and probably not even my top 10. That's in part due to how stacked this year is for games, but also because of how deeply unsatisfying the gameplay was for me. At the end of the day, if you're looking for a lighthearted, visually appealing collection of minigames in the form of a restaurant roguelite, somewhat similar in genre to Recettear, then it's hard to get much better than Dave the Diver. As for me, I think I'll stick with my more mechanically satisfying and systemically deep games. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching my review. If you enjoyed it, feel free to toss a like or subscription my way. Heck, maybe even a positive comment if you're feeling particularly adventurous. I hope you have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye!